Hello, everyone. Okay, today we are talking about stigma for communication theory. The big things you need to get out of this is what the root of stigma is. Irving Goffman, who is a very important scholar with studying stigma, and then also some of the ways in which we've dealt with stigma as a culture, as far as how stigmas are lessened, the ways in which people can have navigated different things that have been stigmatized into them. So that's really sort of what we're doing here today. Just the background on stigma, how it works, how it operates, and how we have evolved past stigmatizing different people for different ailments. All right. Or things that we perceived as ailments, I should say. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. So a little bit of background. Stigma is derived from the Greek word, which really talks about this idea of physically marking someone. So now we think of stigma as this almost psychological or sociological phenomenon where we look at people and we sort of see different characteristics on them and they might be stigmatized. We could stigmatize people for their behavior. But stigma in general was really markings that were put on people who were either slaves or criminals to let the rest of Greek culture know sort of what role those individuals were playing in the society. Yeah, so this is not uh, uncommon to you with regard to the ways in which people have been marked throughout the centuries. It has to do with this idea of deviance. So, in some form or another, right, an individual has deviated from a social norm. So, this gets into more of the psychological or sociological aspects, as opposed to the sort of actual markings that would happen on people. So today it's more of a deviance situation that we might stigmatize someone. So it's important to know that the sort of deviating from social norms could be through a personal act. So it's someone's uh, their individual act or their individual choices have caused them to deviate from the norms. Now, this isn't about moral judgment. Some people actively push against um, uh, sort of societal norms. They might be stigmatized for it, but they're doing it on purpose to either make some sort of statement. An example of this would be something like sexual norms, right? People make choices about their sexuality and their sex life, and people might sort of purposely deviate from traditional norms around sexuality. They might be stigmatized for it, but they've made that personal choice to act against sort of cultural, societal norms around sexuality. So they have deviated from the norm. All right. However, deviance could also be an immutable characteristic, right? So immutable, unchangeable characteristic. Now, this might mean that a society is set up to sort of understand certain people, certain abilities as normal, for instance. And there's ways in which there are people who are born with immutable characteristics that are not normal, right? Now, obviously, a society can act in a very terrible way and sort of ostracize those individuals, push them aside. Um, or a society could recognize that these are immutable characteristics that people have no control over. And so, where in the past those individuals might have been stigmatized or sort of relegated to the margins of society, hopefully, we're progressing in a way in which society recognizes like these people, these individuals who have been stigmatized, they're immutable characteristics. They can't do anything about it. So we shouldn't marginalize them. Uh, but instead, you sort of recognize like what they have is an abnormal ailment that is, not normal. However, that doesn't mean that the, people aren't worthy of being accepted in society as far as, accommodations and making sure things are accessible and the rest of it. All right. So these are the two ways in which stigma can sort of manifest itself, right? So a actual physical marking that's placed on someone, right, or a psychological, sociological phenomenon where people are sort of where people are labeled and pushed to the margins of society. All right. So the couple questions that I would usually ask in class, and you'll all have probably come up with examples in your head while I've been talking so far, is how might individuals be marked or how people have been marked throughout history. And then you could also think about ways in your own life in which you feel like you've been stigmatized, where you've been sort of cast out of if you were a part of a group. Are there behaviors that you've participated in that sort of got you marginalized from that group? Or are there immutable characteristics that you have where you feel like people have been unfairly judging you and stigmatizing you and sort of not letting you into the normal interactions of society? All right. So let's look at a couple examples throughout history where these physical markings or even psychological, sociological markings have been used. All right, so here's a couple like symbols from way back in the day with regard to marks that have been put on people. This has to do with criminal, partially a criminal justice system, right? Um, so people would wear these certain marks to sort of tell you kind of where they were on the ladder of society. This is a picture of a criminal. I believe this is from Russia. So people have been marked, right, with regard to the crimes that they committed. So this individual has tattoos on his face. And so the rest of society, so even if, this person gets out of prison, the rest of society is going to know that that person at one time committed crimes, and therefore, there's psychological and sociological ways in which that person's going to be sort of like actually physically marked for life. All right. You probably at least heard of this book in high school if you did not read it, The Scarlet Letter, where a woman has an affair and then has to walk around with an actual physical A, like a red A on her shirt or on her clothing to sort of mark that she has committed adultery. All right, so this is a physical way in which people are marked with regard to deviating from norms, right? So today adultery isn't a crime, right? You're not going to go to jail for cheating on your significant other, but there are these still these sociological, psychological ways in which you might be relegated to the margins of society for abnormal or impolite sexual behavior, right? Breaking certain sexual mores. Over here, we have, I don't know, this is probably an overseer as opposed to a slave master, but this person, marking slaves, right, in the United States, branding them to let you know that they're different or that they are owned by someone. Here we have, a Jewish star. Study anything on World War II, and then I apologize, my face is covering up the totality of this tattoo, but this tattoo with regard to how Jews were marked once they would get into various concentration camps during World War II, they were physically marked, and there's still some Holocaust survivors who and they're probably in their 90s by now, who still have these tattoos on them as they've lived their entire life with this sort of number, this brand put on them. All right, so there's various ways in which stigma has been, again, physically marked on people's bodies. People have been told that if it's not going to be an actual physical tattoo or a brand, they've been told, you have to wear this piece of this mark with regard to putting it on your clothing so people know. Who you are, and then it's a way to divide up and let the rest of society know who's on the inside and who's on the outside, and it's a way in which people have been marginalized throughout the centuries. Unfortunate, but these are we get back to the class, these are various communication strategies that people have used. How can we make sure that society is broken up into the people who are accepted and the people who are not accepted? We need to put some sort of symbol on them to sort of communicate that person's normalcy, whether or not that person should be accepted, whether or not that person should receive certain public service. These are the communication strategies that have, again, unfortunately been used. So the big person that you need to know, all right, as far as this type of research, is Goffman in the 60s. So Goffman wrote the book, all right, Stigma. You look it up on Amazon. But if you go to grad school and study, this kind of stuff, you're going to know who Goffman is, all right? He's going to pop up a lot in the humanities research, sociology, psychology, communication. He's going to be there, all right? So he comes up with this idea where he's trying to figure out how stigma has worked right? And again, this is just his observation. This isn't him advocating on behalf of marginalizing or breaking up people. He just goes around and says, like, how is this working in society? How do we sort of decide who is in and who is out and who is normal and who is castigated to the margins, all right? So he says, look, like society does create groups of people. Some of those people are considered normal, right? So they get to kind of walk through life and they are unaware that there are other people sort of in life who are stigmatized, right? If I get to just sort of walk around, I get to shop anywhere I want, I get to interact with people in positions of authority, you know, police, administrators, government officials. If I just kind of do the day-to-day normal things, I might be totally unaware that some people don't get to do those normal things, all right, because they have been stigmatized. Again, either you think about ways in like, you know, if a person has a criminal record, right, and they committed a crime, you know, 20 years ago and they got out of jail 20 years ago, but you know, they're still sort of navigating these weird things is every time they turn in a form for employment, or every time they turn in some sort of like, I need an apartment, right? Just like right on there, it says like, do you have a criminal record? And it's something that it carries with them, right, throughout the rest of their life. Now, again, we can argue whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it does recognize like this person has been, this person has to move through life in a way that is abnormal from from the majority of the public. All right. Goffman also talks about people who are wise. So people who are wise are the normal people, but they understand and they empathize with those who have been stigmatized. So these, in 2020 language, you might think about these individuals as allies, right? For various causes. So the people who aren't actually, you know, stigmatized, right? They're not a part of the community that's been marginalized, but they recognize that society has been divided into two different sets of people, right? There's two different rules. There's two sets of rules with regard to how various people are allowed to move through society. So again, normal people, they just sort of see society as this is how it works. I go along with my day. I don't even consider the fact that some people might be treated differently than me because of past behaviors or immutable characteristics. Stigmatized people are very aware of this, right? Because they move through the world and they're treated differently. People who are wise are normal people who sort of recognize like, hey, like that person over there is trying to do the same thing I'm doing and they're being treated differently. Why is it they're being treated differently? Is it because they're, you know, they've been stigmatized in some way, whether it's through a individual choice, right, or through an immutable characteristic. Now let's talk about the immutable characteristics, specifically what Goffman was doing in the 60s. So in the 1960s, the stigma conversation that Goffman was sort of set in, right, is a lot of conversations around these issues of homosexuality, disability, and race. So these were the sort of the immutable characteristics that people were often sort of being pushed out of quote unquote normal society. These were the things that people were being stigmatized with. These characteristics were used to discriminate against people. So this is a lot of Goffman's early discussions in the 1960s with regard to how stigmatization was working. All right. So again, throughout history, people have been stigmatized for lots and lots of reasons. When we're getting into more academic conversations of this, these are the three things that were really sort of like the hot topics during Goffman's time. So Goffman decided to really dig into these issues. So, for example, some of these things that Goffman was sort of recognizing, right? And again, in 2020, we sort of see this and we're like, yeah, it's obvious. But again, imagine sort of being in the culture of the 1960s. If you're normal, this stuff isn't obvious, right? And again, right now, there's a lot of things that seem very normal to us. 50 years from now, people are going to look back and be like, how did you not know this? This was so obvious, right? So have a little bit of humility with regard to people of the 1960s. Recognize that they were moving through a particular culture with a certain set of rules, and they were perceiving the world very differently. It's hard to perceive the historical moment that you're in. You need some time to sort of look back on historical moments. So, for instance, in the 1960s, this idea of, you know, people who are gay might not get a job. All right. So if it's sort of found out that you're gay, an employer is just going to say, no, we're going to go on to the next person, right? You've been stigmatized in a certain way for an immutable characteristic that you have no control over. All right, now with regard to race, there's obvious ways in which we sort of understand race was stigmatizing when we talk about like the Jim Crow South and segregated water fountains. So I'm going to use a different example, right? So I'm not saying this example is the same because I already can sort of like predict, people are going to say, it's not the same. I know it's not the same, all right? So we understand that black people are treated differently in the 1960s than white people, right? But there's also ways in which Goffman talks about sort of like wise people, people who recognize that black people were being treated differently and tried to bridge that gap between sort of normal, right, white culture, or a normal culture that just accepted white people, and the normal culture that stigmatized or marginalized black individuals. So there are individuals, white people specifically, right, who were down in the South promoting civil rights, and they were stigmatized in similar fashions to black individuals because those individuals who were a part of normal society were trying to say, let's bring more people, right? Let's accept people into society and recognize that they're normal as well, right? Let's not marginalize their immutable characteristic because we want to stigmatize some people and we want to not stigmatize others. So if you are a quote unquote normal, and again, this is Goffman's language of the 60s, right? If you are considered normal and you sort of break out and try to become an ally, right, and try to make sure that people are treated fairly, you could sort of society could place those stigmas onto you because you're trying to break the norms. So anytime people are allies, anytime people are quote unquote wise, they could sort of they could receive some of the stigma that the marginalized group is receiving, because again, for whatever reason, various people in positions of power throughout the centuries have liked, right, these groups of like what's considered normal, what's considered abnormal, and for various reasons they have stigmatized some people because they don't want them participating in quote unquote normal society. All right, so yeah, there you have it. Right, so some white people during the civil rights movement might have had stigmas placed onto them, even though they were quote unquote normal. They might have had stigmas placed onto them because they were trying to sort of make sure that the people who were marginalized at the time, specifically black Americans, were trying to make sure that they could also, vote and go to desegregated schools and promotion of civil rights and the rest of it. Goffman talks about these 4 steps with regard to how stigma is sort of put onto an individual. How does stigma work in society? So the first thing you have to do in order to create a stigma around an issue, right? Because none of these stigmatizing things, there's no sort of like ancient book that says, these ought to be, these things should be stigmatized from the beginning of time, right? Obviously, various like ancient books, various religions have stigmatized things, but from the beginning of human history, there was nothing that said like this ought to be stigmatized. So this is how stigmatizing an individual or a group of individuals has worked, right? First, you just have to recognize that there are individual differences, right? And then you label those differences. Now, to recognize objectively that there are differences amongst, humans is not in and of itself terrible, right? You can go around and you can see that different people are different, okay? So that's fine. And then you label them. And even labeling individual differences isn't bad in and of itself, all right? Labels are useful, right, with regard to describing different groups, characteristics within a group, characteristics that are characteristics and differences between groups, right? This is all useful information for various reasons. So that in and of itself is not terrible. This is when it becomes terrible, right? Certain cultural beliefs are normalized, right? Certain labels are normalized, and the people who don't have those labels are therefore stigmatized, all right? As we sort of stigmatize some individuals, not only does it stigmatize that individual out of society, but now all of a sudden we're getting into this like in-group, out-group stuff, right? We create this us versus them, right? This, what's commonly referred to as this sort of like tribal mentality. We start to emphasize the differences between people, All right. So as soon as you say this behavior is normal and this characteristic is abnormal, people want to be a part of the normal crowd because the normal crowd can more easily move through society. All right. So this creates an us versus them, and it's like this is normal, and if only them would sort of take on the characteristics of the normal people, they could be involved in society too. However, again, sometimes those characteristics are immutable. People can't change things about themselves. And if people have things that they can't change about themselves, there's no way in which they could ever be a part of quote unquote normal society. Right? Other things are choices, and people could change those choices, but then it comes a question of like whether or not someone should have to change their behavior or choices that they're making in order to be a part of polite society. It specifically when we're talking about the choices that don't harm other individuals. So you could say, look, if you are committing a crime, that's an individual choice. Sure, we need to make sure that that choice is not normalized. Like we want to stigmatize that behavior. But if we're talking about abnormal sexual behaviors or sexual preferences, um, various kinks that people might have with regard to their bedroom politics. Uh, yeah, like you can look at that and you're like, look, if two consenting adults or more than two consenting adults go into the privacy of their own home, why should that behavior be stigmatized? All right, even if it's not sort of normal traditional sexual behavior. So these are ways in which we create us versus them. This is normal behavior. This is abnormal behavior. It amplifies the us versus them mentality. A lot of people want to be in that normal group because it's just easier to move through society. And people who stay in the quote unquote them category, they are starting to be discriminated against. All right. Or at least sort of, looked down upon, sort of sectioned off from polite society in various ways. Now, sometimes this is linked to power, and I mentioned sometimes, right? So here's the sometimes addendum. All right, it's not always an issue of power. All right, usually it is. All right, usually you have a large group of normal people, and you take a small fraction of the population, kind of section them off, right? Create power. But right, if we take like two evenly split groups, especially when we're talking about like the presidential election, about half the people who vote for Republican, about half the people who vote for Democrat, right? So there is this sort of almost like equal balance of people who identify as, Democrat, Republican in the United States as far as their voting. But, Republicans can stigmatize Democrats, and Democrats can stigmatize Republicans. So even though, so yeah, let me just finish this. In this example, both groups are stigmatized depending on your perspective, right? And the power of like who's in charge of Washington, D.C. changes every 2 to 4 years, right? So the Republicans were just in charge for a little bit of time. Now the Democrats will be in charge. In a couple of years, Republicans will get a little bit of power here. Democrats will power go up and down. Like it all kind of goes up and down. It's pretty evenly split. But you have these two pretty equally powerful groups that kind of go back and forth stigmatizing each other. So it's not always linked to power with regard to stigmatization. All right, final slide here, okay? How does one get rid of stigma? All right. The first way in which people have tried to get rid of stigma is by concealing it. So, for instance, the idea of passing, which you might have heard of if you've taken some sort of civil rights class, early 20th century American history, of individuals who were black who could pass as white, right? So there's a way in which they try to conceal their their blackness in order to sort of like get along in a society that is racist and discriminatory. Immigrants who came over to the United States might have changed their surname, right? So they changed their last name to sound more American. If you think about individuals who have Italian last names, they might have changed it. Individuals who had Jewish last names would change it. So various groups who were stigmatized or discriminated against when they came over through Ellis Island, right? They came over on the boat during turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s. They might have gotten to Ellis Island and say, I'm going to change my name just because it's going to make it a little bit easier. All right, I'm still Jewish, but I'm going to change my last name to not sound so Jewish. I'm still Italian, but I'm going to change my last name to sound not so Italian because it might be easier for me to get a job. Because there were ways in which immigrants from these European countries were discriminated against. Um, I just had another example, but well, with concealing, um, if we think about so these are more immutable characteristics. If we think about characteristics that are of choice, there might be ways in which people leave off their criminal record on a legal document, even though it's like you have to, if you're applying for a job or you're applying for like housing, it might say like you have to be truthful on this, and you might not put down like 20 years ago I did something I went to jail for some sort of criminal act. People might just try to conceal it. They say, you know what, it happened 20 years ago. I don't want to put this out there because I might not get the job. So I'm going to try to conceal my criminal past, so that I can so I can get along in sort of normal society. You can disrupt the social norms around the stigma. So you can try to go around and change people's ideas and say, look, this shouldn't be considered a stigma anymore. So throughout the 1990s, early 2000s, a lot of this was done, and we talked about this in various other classes. A lot of this was done around the LGBT community. So, shows like Ellen, Queer Eye for, not Ellen, the talk show now, but Ellen actually had a sitcom back in the 90s. So Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, Will and Grace, right? So we're trying to disrupt the stigmatizing attitude that we had towards homosexuality in the 1990s, early 2000s. We're just trying to sort of change the norms and say, look, this shouldn't be a stigmatized. This sexuality shouldn't be stigmatized. All right. So this is disrupting is sort of completely changing and say this act shouldn't be stigmatized. This is different from aesthetics, because aesthetics, we still see it as a stigmatizing, we would still see it as a stigmatizing behavior, but we try to lower the degree of the stigmatization. So we could look at something and say, look, a criminal record is still something that we shouldn't accept. We shouldn't accept criminal behavior, but we should lower the degree of stigma around it and sort of recognize that sometimes, mostly men in the early 18 to 22-year-old range make stupid mistakes, and that shouldn't stick with them their entire life, right? So with disrupt, we say, look, get rid of the stigma around homosexuality, right? For instance, with aesthetics, it's like, look, criminal behavior is still bad, but that shouldn't stick with somebody forever, all right? So maybe there needs to be some sort of sunset clause that says, after you've been out of jail for X amount of time and you have a clean record, you don't have to disclose your criminal record on like job applications or housing applications or whatever, right? So we try to lower the degree of stigma, even though we still want the behavior itself to be frowned upon, all right? So this comes to our final question, which is important. Do we want to get rid of all stigma? This is a very important question, right? Because sometimes people hear the word stigma and we have this attitude in society where sometimes we say things like the following, like, don't judge me for anything. And I always ask, like, but are there some things that maybe we should still judge? Like, do you really want this sort of, do you really want to live in a society where nothing's judged, where it's just sort of like allow all sorts of behaviors to exist, where we don't sort of question people's choices? Like, I'm not sure that anybody wants that. I think it's a good bumper sticker. I think a lot of people like saying this because it sounds good. Don't judge other people. Let's not judge behaviors. Let everybody kind of live and let live type of attitude. But I think on an individual level, we all judge people's behavior sometimes. And so it's a conversation that's ongoing. So something to think about, right? Now, I'm not telling you what you should and shouldn't stigmatize, but just something to think about with regard to, do you want to get rid of all stigma from your society? So you say something like, what stigmatized things might you want to hold on to? So if we come to things like sexual mores, right, sexuality, do we want to uphold a society that celebrates monogamy, right? So look, you and your spouse get married, and we want to uphold a culture where, sex is confined to that, marriage. Is that something that you want to hold on to or not hold on to? Pedophilia obviously is a pretty obvious one. Like, that's something I think, probably should be stigmatized. With regard to sexuality and polite conversations, right? Are there certain areas where we don't want sort of the rudeness of sex conversations? Plenty of ways to have polite conversations about sexuality. But there's some places where people are just making crass jokes, and maybe you don't want to overhear crass jokes or like profanity, right? Maybe you don't want to hear these things in casual everyday settings. So maybe if someone tells a rude joke, um, yeah, maybe it's like, yeah, I'm gonna judge you. Like, please don't swear in front of my kids while we're at Pizza Hut. All right. Um, we have these sort of conversations around STDs, right? Do we want to normalize STDs, or do we still want to stigmatize them in some ways, not to discriminate against people who might have various STDs, but as ways to let people know that um, STDs are something that you'd like to avoid. All right. Health norms, there's plenty of conversations going on with this idea of fat shaming or obesity. Should it be medically diagnosed? Should various people go on diets for certain reasons? There's been a lot of conversation in the last year with regard to COVID. Um, we understand that people with higher BMIs who are close to obese or obese have a more difficult time with COVID. So people who are in better shape are more likely to be okay with regard to COVID outcomes. So do we want to have conversations where it's like maybe we should be talking about healthier lifestyles in a way that doesn't shame people, but in a way where we sort of make it known that there are certain health norms that we should all be striving towards. And again, finally, language. Do you want profanity, like bigotry, right? Like that's something I'm like, yeah, I think we should stigmatize bigotry. If I hear someone tell like say something racial in public, say something racist in public, or tell a joke that's bigoted in some reason, like yeah, like I would want you to step in and say, hey, look, like I'm gonna judge you, like don't say those things in polite society. We don't want to hear those words again, like while we're out eating as a family or something. All right. So do you want to get rid of all stigma? I think an easy catch-all phrase for most people when they begin to hear these conversations is like, yes, let's get rid of all stigma. But again, when you start going like point by point or things that are currently stigmatized, I think people start to realize like, no, there are some things that I would like to see. I would still like to see them stigmatized because there's a way in which we have ordered society around making sure that people aren't going around like saying bigoted things in public, even though they're legally allowed to. I think it's a good thing that we have stigmatized the use of certain words in polite conversations in public, to the point that those, for the most part, certain words aren't used in public anymore. Or if they are used, immediately people get called out on it. You can see this with like celebrities who have like posted awful things on Twitter or said awful things on camera. They've lost their job, or they lost endorsements, or they've lost, they've had to come out and, some sort of mea culpa. I apologize for something I said when I was 15 years old, whatever. Right. So these are like stigmatizing things. And it's sort of, in my opinion, it sort of has created a more welcoming society for everybody. So we don't want to just fall into this idea of like all stigma is bad, don't ever stigmatize. But we should have conversations with regard to what do we stigmatize, to what degree do we stigmatize, do we lower the degree of stigma, and then if it's some sort of personal choice of behavior, is there a way up towards redemption for a person who has been stigmatized to be welcomed back into polite society? All right. So again, this question of like lowering the degree of stigma, you could use an example of a person commits a criminal act 20 years ago. It should be stigmatized, but is there a way towards redemption where that person is welcomed back into normal society and we no longer look at that person as a criminal for the rest of his or her life, right? Someone might have used, bad language or sent some tweet that was awful. Maybe they need to apologize for it. We don't condone it. We still stigmatize that behavior, but we say there's a path for redemption for that person to be welcome back in society, right? So these behaviors, there might be a path for redemption. We still stigmatize them. Obviously, immutable characteristics, people can't change their immutable characteristics. So that might be more of a conversation of making sure that we disrupt those social norms and say, look, like these are immutable characteristics and we should sort of get rid of stigma around them, so that people are sort of, welcomed into society for things that are abnormal, for things that they can't control. All right, that's our discussion on stigma. We'll talk a little bit more next time.